Hello there. Welcome back to Daddy Roll the One. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the 4 tabletop role-playing game books that I would want with me to run all of my future campaigns under the assumption that I could never get another one. I would just be stuck with those 4 for the rest of my life. So today I'm going to be talking about the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. In previous parts of this series, I have talked about my criteria for how I picked the books. In part 2 specifically, I went over the details and the context of why that was my criteria. Part 1, I talked about the Tome of Adventure Design. Part 2 was Knock Magazine. Part 3 was, I was being a little flexible. I said I want either Veins of the Earth or a Folklore Bestiary. And then today I'm going to be talking about this book. This is part 4, Dungeon Master's Guide. They're not listed in order, by the way. It's just the order that I thought of them. So that's how I recorded the videos. So right out the gate, I do have to be honest. Part of the reason I picked this book is just nostalgia. So I've had this book for nearly 40 years. I got it back in I got it in 1984, maybe early 85. It's been with me across multiple moves, multiple states, college dorms and back. So it's just a book that I return to time and again. So it is nostalgia, but there are tools in here that I still use. So it is a utility book, even though I do keep it. I did pick it partly on nostalgia basis. So I started playing the game in 1981. And as I just mentioned, I didn't get this until about 3 or 4 years later. And part of the reason is because Gary Gygax, as you saw, who wrote this book, he says right here at the beginning in the preface, as this book is the exclusive precinct of the DM, you must view any non-DM player possessing it as something less than worthy of honorable death. Peeping players there will undoubtedly be, but they are simply lessening their own enjoyment of the game by taking away some of the sense of wonder that otherwise arises from a game which has rules hidden from participants. It is in your interests, and in theirs, to discourage possession of this book by players. If any of your participants do read herein, it is suggested that you assess them a heavy fee for consulting sages and other sources of information not normally attainable by the inhabitants of your milieu. If they express knowledge which could only be garnered by consulting these pages, a magic item or 2 can be taken as payment. Insufficient, but perhaps it will tend to discourage such actions. So right there is a perfect example of the way that Gary Gygax writes. And it's something that I just grew up with. So players my age will refer to that type of writing as high Gygaxian. And this is probably the book that illustrates that the best. But Gary loved writing like that. He loved that flowery language. He loved using specific turns of phrase. He'll refer to the person that's reading this book as you, gentle reader, and then go on to tell you something. And he loves archaic terms such as I remember I was reading a module that he wrote once, an adventure, and he mentioned that the amount of time that it would take to go from point A to point B would be a sennight. Now I'm staring at that word. I'm 12 or 13 years old, and I was like, what is a sennight? And I looked it up in the dictionary. It's a week. That's all it is. It just means week. But Gary loved to use that kind of archaic term, partly, I guess, just based on the kind of literature and the books that he grew up with. So I'll say that it does sometimes make it difficult to parse the information that he's trying to give to you. So a modern role-playing game design, the writing is going to be much more clear and concise and easier to convey the information that it wants you to have in order to be able to run and play the game. That is very difficult to get out of this. It's sometimes Gary's writing gets in the way, I'll put it that way, of understanding how to run the game. However, as a kid, I felt a sense of accomplishment by being able to figure out that kind of writing. And if I'm stuck on a desert island and I only have 4 books to run a game, this is going to give me some reading pleasure, whereas typical role-playing game books do tend to read more like technical manuals or textbooks, just because of they're trying to make it clearer to understand. So hopefully that helps explain that a little bit. The other thing that's really interesting with this book is that if you remember from my video series on the history of the 18 different Advanced Dungeons & Dragons hardbacks, the game was not published all at the same time. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was not published simultaneously. The Monster Manual came out in 1977. The Player's Handbook came out in 1978. And then this book came out in 1979. So after this book was released, while Gary's writing this book's been released, people are asking questions. There are things that aren't addressed in this book. Okay, so a great example is Gary talks in here about the thieves skills and what those thieves skills are. He doesn't tell a DM how to adjudicate those skills, or even a player how to use them. What does it mean? How do you hide in shadows, and what exactly does that mean? And so this book explains that. So people were writing questions. They were writing Gary or calling him on the phone, or they were writing Dragon Magazine asking these questions. So once you know that background, the first part of this book kind of almost feels like it's addressing things that should have been in the player's handbook. So a great example of that would be, this was in my video on the history of skills in the game, but background skills or secondary skills table, there's no reason for this to be in the DM's guide. Players should have had access to this. And things like character age. How old can I be as a dwarf versus an elf? That's the thing. People used to be really obsessed with this back in the day. So he talks about that here in the setup. And then one of the things that I think is kind of fun is over here, he talks about determination of maximum age, and he says the DM should roll that in secret. So he gives rules for how to do that, but the DM should figure out when a character is going to die of old age. Now, I know nowadays that would be seen as taking away player agency, and I totally get that. It's a very different style of play. However, if you have the right group of players and your group is open to this idea of having this thing where they know that they're going to die at some point of old age, but they just don't know when, there's a section here that talks about when you're casting certain high-level spells, you're drawing on so much arcane magical energy that it actually ages your character. So a powerful spell like Haste or Gate or Wish is going to age your character somewhere between 3 and 5 years, or basically cut that amount of time off their lifespan, right? So if you know that, and you know that at some point your character is going to die from old age, but you don't know when, and then you're casting a spell like Wish, you're going to be a lot more judicious about casting that spell, because you know that, like, well, is this really worth of me taking 5 years off of my maximum lifespan to cast this Wish spell? And it just creates tons of role-playing opportunities that, again, with the right group, I think is a lot of fun. So there's tons of little things like that that are really based on mechanics of the game, but you realize it's in here to create, again, role-playing opportunities. So he talks in here about stuff like, ability scores, things like that, henchmen, assassination tables for assassins, poison types, a whole section here on why Gary doesn't think you should run a monster character for AD&D. And OD&D, he said it was totally fine. There was, imagination is the limit. And here he's very specific. No, AD&D, you should not have monster characters. So stuff on lycanthropes, alignment languages, and then money. And then so all this stuff is about player characters, and then bam, key to gem properties. Where's that coming from? This book is not very well organized. It's very hard to find in here what you're looking for, which explains why the table of contents, the table of contents is so long. I mean, look at that. And it's because, I feel like some of this was just put in here in the order that he thought of it. So there's this whole section on the reputed magical properties of gems. But then he tells you, don't give player characters just because they found a gem. Don't give that to them. But they might think it has that property. But again, role-playing opportunities. So tons of stuff in here on, again, like spell explanations and how they work, how to adjudicate those spells, and underwater adventures. Very lovely illustration. And then there's a section here on combat. But what I want to go to is this section back here on page 113. Wait, classic cartoon really quickly. So it's a great new fantasy role-playing game. We pretend we're workers and students in an industrialized and technological society. So the Dungeon Master's Guide is full of just these little cute, funny cartoons like this, as well as, standard fantasy illustrations. But this is a section that I read over and over and over again as a kid. This is Sixguns and Sorcery and Mutants and Magic. So Sixguns and Sorcery is talking about mixing D&D with Boot Hill. It's a Wild West role-playing game published by TSR. Role-playing game is a little bit of a strong term because it was really more about gunfight combat. So almost like what we would call player versus player now, or, just it's combat type rules, very minimal role-playing game rules. But Gary talks about maybe your D&D characters go through a magic portal and they end up in a Wild West setting. And so he gives rules on how to convert characters between the two games, between Boot Hill and AD&D. And rules for firearms and all that kind of stuff. And then the other one is Mutants and Magic, based on this game, also published by TSR Gamma World. This was my second role-playing game that I'd ever played as a kid, but also my second favorite game after D&D. This is a post-apocalyptic role-playing game. And I grew up as a Cold War kid where the threat of nuclear war at the time seemed very, very real. And the idea that we might be living in a society that's been blasted by nuclear radiation and having to learn how to survive, that was something that we all kind of thought like that's a real possibility. So this game takes it in that science fantasy realm where radiation gives you powers. It doesn't just kill you. So if you've ever seen the cartoon or heard the cartoon Thundar the Barbarian, this section on mutants and magic of mixing D&D with Gamma World, that would help you create that kind of cartoon. So I read this a ton as a kid. So then you get into your treasures, magical research, how to research new magical spells. But the part of this book that I would use mostly in a game right now would be these appendices. So look how long the appendices in this are compared to the rest of the book here. I mean, it's a huge section of the book. And right out the gate, you get random dungeon generation. So this is generating a dungeon by rolling dice and just figuring out how long is the corridor, what's it going to turn, which direction, how big is the room going to be, what's in the corridor, or what's in the room, all this kind of stuff, just generating a dungeon. Treasures guarded by what? Treasures are hidden by what? Caves and caverns, pools, lakes, all this kind of stuff in a dungeon setting. And then he does the same thing for random wilderness terrain. So using dice to help you determine things I love that kind of stuff. Then you've got random monster encounters, which goes on quite a bit, but it's divided by terrain type and by climate. Very classic, and then a famous illustration, a mirror called the Chaotic. And then it's got this section on random generation of creatures from the lower planes, and it talks about how to use these tables for their head and adornment, their ears, eye color, nose, mouth. Are they bipedal or quadrupedal? What's their tail look like? Their body odor. I mean, just skin, wings, back, tons of great stuff in here for generating a demon or a devil from the lower planes. Okay. Then you have a recapitulation of all the monsters that are in the monster manual. So you don't need your monster manual because you have the information right here. Then you've got Appendix F, gambling. So if your player characters are in that, and then you have traps. Then you have tricks. Then you have dungeon dressing. This is one of my favorite sections in here. So what are the air currents? What are the smells? What are some weird sounds that you might hear? What's the air like? Okay. And then it just keeps going. So, magic user furnishings, religious amenities and furnishings. Okay. For generating, dungeon dressing and trappings. Okay. Really super helpful to a DM. Then you've got herbs, spices, and medicinal vegetables. This whole section on just tons and tons of stuff here. And then you have describing magical substances. This is gold. And again, usable in any edition of the game. But, when you give your characters a potion, don't tell them it's a potion of healing. Tell them that it has these certain characteristics of what it tastes like or what it smells like or if it's transparent. And then let them remember that next time so that when you describe it again, they go, oh, yeah, that's the potion of healing. Don't just go, it's a potion of healing. Don't make magic mundane. Use these descriptive words to make it come alive, right? That's what I love about stuff like this. Conjuring animals. Then this is one of my favorite sections, the classic Appendix N, inspirational and educational reading. These are the authors and books that influenced Gary Gygax, also Dave Arneson to an extent, but this is Gary's list. He talks about EC comics from the 50s and 60s, and then he lists all these authors and books that influenced him in terms of writing the game and the kind of aesthetic that he was going for. So I've been doing a series on Twitter and Instagram where I'm taking each one of these authors individually and then making lists of the most commonly used descriptive words that they used in their writing to help DMs get out of that rut of just describing the things the same way over time. It's cold or it's dark. So it's giving you these lists of words that you might not normally think of to kind of help you be a little bit more descriptive. So that is basically this particular book. Okay, that's the Dungeon Master's Guide, first edition, AD&D. Now, let's say either this isn't your cup of tea, you don't like this style of writing by Gary Gygax. I can totally understand that. I probably have a little bit of a different viewpoint just because I've been with it for much longer. Or maybe you already have this book and you're looking for something else. Some options for you. Dungeons & Dragons, 3.5 edition, Dungeon Master's Guide 2. Okay, so this is a really great book because it actually tells you how to run a game, which so many DM guides don't do. So your job as a DM, different play styles. When you're at the table, communication, keep it moving, paying attention. When you're away from the table, what should you be doing? Adventures, traps, different kinds of archetypal locations, chase scenes, crowds, mobs, using miniatures. Okay, they're building your campaign, non-player characters, and then this whole city here of Saltmarsh. So old school players will recognize Saltmarsh from the module U1, The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. Saltmarsh wasn't even described by that. It was published in the 80s. So here you have a whole city that you can drop into your campaign with NPC names and building locations and all that kind of stuff is all in here. 5e players will recognize Saltmarsh too as part of a recent 5e adventure, okay? But this is great information that none of it is mechanics driven. It's all about, tips and things to help a DM run a particular game. Okay. Also, the 4E Dungeon Master's Guide. Okay, don't get scared. I know people don't like their 4E, and I totally get it. It's very, very different. However, there's nothing really too much mechanical in here. But look at this advice for helping people run games. Okay. So how to be a DM, your players, your game group, your table rules, getting started, narration, pacing, props, improvising. Okay, that's stuff that so many old school Dungeon Master's Guide books didn't have. They didn't have this information on how to improvise. And this has a whole thing on how to do that. Combat encounters and keeping things moving. And, there is a little bit of stuff in here on skill challenges, which is a big part of 4E, but just ignore that part and take the rest of this. That's all system or edition neutral. A lot of people say that this is one of the better DM guides that's ever been written for a role-playing game in terms of teaching people how to play. This one might be my favorite. This is the Pathfinder role-playing game, Pathfinder First Edition Game Mastery Guide. Okay, but again, look at this table of contents. Getting started, your duties as a DM, your tone, maturity, DM as a host, rules of the house, running your game, creating the campaign guide, the art and science of GMing, and then it has this whole section on non-player characters and creating your world, advanced topics, so much great stuff in here. So it has things like chase scenes, disasters, drugs and addiction, fortune-telling, gambling, and games of choice, haunts, hazards, mysteries, investigations. So much really great stuff in here. So this is one of my favorite sections. Look at all these tables. NPC backgrounds, NPC goals, physical characteristics, personality characteristics. Okay, and it keeps going. Occupations is here. And then you've got NPC secrets, NPC rewards for heroic deeds, random adventuring party name generator. How fun is that? Okay, tons of great stuff. And then over here, this is another section I really, really like. So this is on detailing your world and just talking about things like geography and culture. Okay, and things like, then it goes into like the primitive society and a feudal society, a rural and agrarian society, a cosmopolitan society. And then you have questions about your city. So much great stuff in here. So super, super helpful. Gets into the cosmos and space travel. I mean, just great, great stuff. So you have that. A couple other ones that I don't own, but I get a lot of really good reviews. There's Sly Flourish's Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. There's a link to that below in the show notes. And then there's also the second edition Creative Campaigning and Catacomb Guide, I believe it's called. I know one of my friends on Twitter is a huge fan of this book. So definitely check that out. And that's going to be all for today. So thank you so much for watching. And if you could please like and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video. And also if you could share it on your social media to help me grow my channel. And definitely please leave me some comments. Let me know what you liked or didn't like or what your choices would be for your 4 books. And again, that's it for today. So stay safe and I will talk to you next time.